Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Josh Feigelson is president and CEO of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. He received rabbinic ordination at YCT Rabbinical School, and he has a doctorate in religious studies from Northwestern University, where he served as a Hillel rabbi. He was founder and executive director of Ask Big Questions, a project of Hillel International, which won the inaugural Lippmann-Kampfer Prize for Applied Jewish Wisdom. Prior to joining IJS, Josh served as Dean of Students at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He has published numerous articles and chapters in both academic and popular publications. His book, Eternal Questions, is his first. Josh lives in Skokie, Illinois, where my husband hails from. And Josh lives with his wife, the wonderful Natalie Blitt, and their 3 children. Welcome, Josh. It's great to have you on this broadcast. And full disclosure, I've been so honored that you asked me to be on the Institute of Jewish Spirituality's Advisory Council, which has sort of Jewish irony considering how neurotic and unrelaxed and unspiritual I am in my old age. I need IJS like everybody needs IJS. It's wonderful that you're at the helm of such an important place right now. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Abby. It's really great to be here, and I really appreciate you making this space.
Josh, let's start with the title, Eternal Questions. Before we get to the subtitle, why Eternal Questions? We know what eternal means, but why is it so important to you? Because I know you're someone who really lives in the questions.
Well, I think that questions are not something we really think about a whole lot, many of us, unless we're lawyers or we're journalists like you, right? We're probably not trained to think about questions all that much. And I think that's a loss because I think different questions do different kinds of work. And what I'm most interested in this book and have been for the last 10 or 15 years of my career has really been in this field of what I would call big questions, or I think eternal questions also is a good name for them, are these questions that matter to everybody and that everybody can answer. And I think they are vital for spiritual work and for living in community, because a lot of times we get focused on what we call hard questions. Like hard questions are like, what's the definition of responsibility? What does it mean to do X, or what should we do about climate change, or what should we do about, et cetera? Those are all questions that matter to everyone, but not everybody can answer, right? You have to have special training, as opposed to a question like, who are you responsible for? Or who are we responsible for? And all of a sudden that becomes a question that matters to all of us and that all of us can answer. It doesn't matter if you are, Bill Gates, or you're the person who cleans Bill Gates's shoes, right? Everybody has just as valid, just as much of an answer to that question. It's a question that sort of creates a horizon for our lives. And so those kinds of questions, I think, are vital to me. They're the best kinds of questions. They're all the best Torah learning that I've ever done is sort of a response to what I would call these big or eternal questions that we come back to again and again and again, that invite us to go deeper, to link our personal experience with a larger conversation about not just what it means to be human, but the experience of being human.
And I know that you feel like these questions are actually baked in to the Torah. It's not like we have to reach so deeply for them. They're presenting themselves kind of in a way that both challenge and energize us. But why did you feel like this had not been done before? I mean, without maligning the books about Torah that have come before, and there's obviously
Sure.
shelves and shelves of them, why is this book kind of needed and new?
Well, I think one of the reasons is, so this book does a few things. I mean, in terms of the kinds of questions that it asks, and using each essay is actually, it's essays on the weekly Torah portion, so you can read it as you go through every Torah portion during the year. Every essay is titled with a big question, and I know you want to talk about that in a little bit. Look at some examples, but questions like, where do we feel at home, right? For whom are we responsible? How are we silent? How do we connect? Right? These kinds of questions. And instead of being names of themes or names of topics, which are very frequently how Torah essays, are presented, each one of these is titled with one of those big questions. And I think that's important and it's significant. It creates a different way that we might approach the Torah portion.
And I just, before you go on, I just want to throw out some of the examples so that the audience can hear it. We're not going to delve into all of these, but just so people have a feel for the questions. For Parsha Vayetze, how do we experience the divine in our lives? For Shemot, how do we cry out? For Amor, how does time move us? For Pinchas, when are we unified? And Devarim, what do we say? I mean, before we go even into any of these are questions that you could ask without the Torah. So how is the Torah kind of instrumental, if that makes sense, as an instrument?
Right. So I think this is actually putting Torah, it's framing Torah through a lens or a frame of human experience, right? And it invites us into a kind of dialogue and reflection that we can share with ourselves. So we can have a dialogue with Torah, a conversation about Torah through these questions, and we can share with other people because we share these questions by virtue of being human and having lived on the planet for more than 5 minutes, right? We have stories to share about those kinds of questions. What do we say, right? When we're talking about Devarim, how do we connect, etc. So I think just framing them in that way changes, when I look at many of my teachers, and I actually gently sort of mention in the introduction to the book, I mention, some of the great folks who have written wonderful, wonderful, instructive work on the Torah for me, Aviva Zornberg, right, Nechama Leibovich, Shai Held, Jonathan Sachs, but when I look through their books, very often, sometimes they'll use questions, but very often it's a statement, it's a theme that this is about this, which is fine and it works great. But it sometimes leaves me, I feel like we might, there's an opportunity to have a different kind of conversation. But that also links up with another feature of the book that's very important, which is at the end of each essay, a lot of times those questions are just too big, right? And what's most important to me about this book is that I don't want people to have an experience where they read it and they're like, oh, that was really interesting. I feel like, it's 2022. There's too much on the line in the world right now for things to simply be interesting. They have to be transformative, right? We have to be able to take this into our lives and say, how can I actually apply this? How could this actually manifest in some way in my life? And so we do that through two ways in this book. One is there's a set of then reflection questions, which you could ask yourself, but you could also have a conversation with a chavruta, a learning partner, a study partner, or a group, right? Just FYI, bulk discounts for synagogues or other adult education, right? But you could totally have a conversation about some of those follow-up questions that are about examining our own experience through the lens of what we've studied. That's also a new thing. A lot of the books that I mentioned, they're really interesting essays, but they don't necessarily then make that connection to my life. And the last thing we do, and this is the Jewish mindfulness practices part of the subtitle, is that we actually then put in with the help of a lot of my colleagues at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, ideas of practices that you can then do in your life, right, that week, or you can take with you after reading that essay and say, how can I make this now again, a visible part of my life that it can actually make a change. It can help me show up as a better person, as the person I want to be in the world. And
when you say practices, I feel like many of us need practice with practices because it's not necessarily in our either emotional or practical vocabulary each day. We don't necessarily prioritize it, even know how to make time for it. Are you assuming that those reading it already have a spirituality practice, that they already know how either to meditate or to, maybe they've done Musar where they explore the midot, the traits, or are you saying for anyone who never has done this, we are actually giving you the tools to begin?
So this is absolutely a book for people wherever you are on that journey. You do not need to have any prior experience doing meditation or Musar or any other particular practice. I do think you'll get more out of it if you're open to that, right? And certainly if you have a practice, this will be helpful. But if you don't and you're looking to develop one, this will give you some tools. And there's a lot of other tools that are out there too. You can come to our website, jewishspirituality.org. There's lots of other organizations where if you get a taste from this and say, oh, I'd really like to go deeper and understand experience what is meditation, for instance, and how might that be part of my life, great. But there's no sort of like prior experience necessary. There's no assumption about that. Yeah.
I want to back up for a minute and just talk about IJS so that people understand what we're talking about, the Institute of Jewish Spirituality. If you can give us kind of a on one foot history of it and what it kind of is there to do, what its mission is, and why did you actually want to be there to lead it?
Super. So IJS was founded in 1999 by Rabbi Rachel Cowan, Rabbi Nancy Flam, and several others who, in many ways, it was a response to the phenomenon of Boo Jews, of Jews who, people who grew up Jewish and then found meaning and practice in Buddhism and other forms of Eastern spirituality.
I just want to make sure people heard Boo Jews. That's what they're called.
Yes, Boo Jews.
Yes.
Or Jew Boos, right?
Or
The term
right.
can be interchangeable. And so, in the 1990s, there was a lot of sense of crisis about Jewish continuity in general. And I think that there was anxiety that was sort of provoked about, we're losing all of these people to Buddhism. What's going on, right? Hundreds of thousands of people who grew up Jewish, embraced Buddhist practices. And many of the great American Buddhist teachers today are people with names like, Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg. And it's wonderful and it's great.
Sylvia Boorstein.
And Sylvia Boorstein, right. And so there was a real question of what can we learn from that, right? What can we learn from that about what's going on? And how is it that in our own tradition, we have such riches of spiritual practice? How might we need to present them in a different way in order to revitalize and renew Judaism and Jewish practice, that it might speak to people and they could find what they're looking for in their own backyard, right, in their own home. And so IJS started with our flagship program has been training clergy, has been a clergy leadership program that we've run for over 20 years. We now have over 500 alumni of that program, and it's an 18-month program that takes a cohort of rabbis and cantors together who over that 18 months do silent retreats together. They study together weekly. They develop a meditation practice. And some of the fruits of that, are that, Abby, at your synagogue, at Central Synagogue, meditation and silence now, are regular features of the service. Yeah. And Rabbi Angela Buchtel, who's one of our alumni, right, leads a meditation group. And other rabbis and cantors from that synagogue and many, many others are doing the same thing. And what it's done is I think it's given us a richer vocabulary. It doesn't mean that we're going to, we're not adopting Zen practices or, Theravada Buddhist practices. What we're doing is we're taking some of these same tools and we're applying them with the language of Torah and the symbols and rhythms of Jewish life. And the effect of that has been to deepen a lot of people's experience of what Judaism can be. So our mission today, the mission of IJS, is to develop and teach Jewish spiritual practices so that individuals and communities may experience greater awareness, purpose, and interconnection. That's what we do. I got here, I came to IJS in February 2020, so I had about 6 weeks of normal before the pandemic. And I'm in some ways an unlikely candidate. I didn't come through, having spent time in ashrams or, sitting on long, silent retreats. I didn't have a meditation practice too much before I came to IJS. And I came because I think I have always been interested and drawn towards teaching Torah and living Torah in a way that really registers the full human experience, isn't just an intellectual exercise, though, I love that, but really takes cognizance of the heart, of the body, of the spirit. And so I was drawn to IJS's clergy program as an individual and had started in that program. And then it was actually my friend Eliza Klein, who's the CEO of One Table. Wonderful. And Eliza is one of those people who I would just trust, if she told me to jump off a high building, I would do it because I just trust her that much. And And she said, IGS is looking for an executive director. I think you should really look at that and always take Elisa's advice. And so I did. And it's been an incredible partnership. And I feel very, very privileged to be here.
And IJS was already kind of taking off, but the pandemic kind of quadrupled the interest and the need. And I joked before about being kind of neurotic and having difficulty slowing down. But I should say that there are many clergy who have gone through IJS programs that I, as a layperson, have had the benefit of being with and learning from and experiencing. You have paws on your wall behind you. It feels like it's absolutely integral to our Jewish tradition, this idea of paying attention, of slowing down, of stopping working, of kind of looking to your right and left at who might need us. Of appreciation, of gratitude. So all of these things, they feel less, in a sense, I say crunchy, even though that's sort of an old derogatory term, but they feel less kind of 1970s when you actually see how rooted they are in our teachings and our tradition.
Absolutely. And a big piece of that is also we have historically drawn heavily on the Hasidic tradition. And that's another feature of this book, is that each of the essays sort of is anchored in a Hasidic teaching about the Torah portion, but then I put them in dialogue. I'm looking at some of the books behind me. I think Bell Hooks is back there, and some other, and Vladimir Jankelevich, who I think we'll talk about. But I really try to put them in dialogue with a wide array of contemporary voices and other voices. And so, I think about, if you're somebody who likes reading Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's work, for instance, or Shai Held's work, or Aviva Zornberg, some of the people I mentioned, I think you will resonate with this book because you'll be used to that kind of weaving that they do, so beautifully. And the anchoring it in and centering it around a Hasidic work. Also, the Hasidic tradition really has become revived in so many ways by non-Orthodox Jews. In Orthodoxy, certainly, yes, but among liberal Jews, it's also become recognized that the Hasidic sources, what they were doing was really ahead of their time. Well, it was in their time and ahead of their time. Speaking to us now, it's a very human-centered form of Jewishness, and really,
and it's not just the intellectual, right? It's very,
and
it's
insightful
much more
about
visceral,
spiritual, psychological, right? Really advanced and insightful about the human condition, and registers again that full-bodied, full-hearted human experience. And so that's why I try to center this around a Hasidic text and put it in dialogue with contemporary voices.
Let's zero in on one of the examples of the chapters, the Noah story, which is familiar to so many of us, and it's obviously early in Genesis. And the question that you pose for Noah is, when do we feel secure? And I'm quoting you, one of the enduring questions of the story of Noah is why he seemingly failed to save anyone other than his immediate family from the flood. So you're kind of addressing the selfishness of one of the kind of our major figures of our Torah, and you obviously take it in many directions. But can you just give a sense of how you chose to frame that with that question, when do we feel secure?
Yeah, well, so the story of Noah, right, centers in many ways on this experience of being in an ark. What does it mean to have the entire world is destroyed around you, and you and a few close loved ones and then a bunch of animals are on this ark, and you and are you secure in that moment? Like what's the experience of that? What's the quality of that experience? Not just the meaning of it, but like inviting on a more visceral level, what does that feel like? And for all of us, that should register things, is my guess, right? We all every day, in every moment even, we are consciously or subconsciously working through, am I secure here, right? Am I not secure? Do I feel welcome? Do I not feel welcome? Do I feel at home? Do I not feel at home? That's so baked into us sometimes that, it's just about our fight or flight mechanism. But when we think about today, in the language of, diversity, equity and inclusion and belonging, right? Am I secure? Do I feel safe enough? Right. I think in this essay, I actually went to some discussion of like the language of safe spaces, right, and safe enough spaces. That's actually, we shouldn't dismiss that. It's actually a really important question. In order for growth to happen, in order for learning to happen, any good teacher, any educator, any parent will know, right, that you have to create an environment where people feel safe enough to feel welcome, to feel like they can be vulnerable, to feel like they can do their work. So,
one of the, just want to mention, because you talked about how you do the sort of the delving in, the Hasidic teaching, then you come to the questions for reflection and conversation, and I just want to offer some of them for the Noah chapter. Can you think of a time when you were able to overcome a feeling of insecurity in order to take a risk or do something that, which you were afraid of? If so, what happened? Who or what helped you? If not, what do you sense prevented you? I mean, I want to give people a sense that you're actually speaking in contemporary language, even though some of the learning is very dense.
Yeah, right. So there's something here for everybody, right? I mean, if you're looking for something that's like on an intellectual level, you'll find that, right? And to me, the thing that I spent more time on than anything in the book is these questions that are afterwards, right? That to me is about how do you then bring it home? Mm-hmm. How do you bring it into your own life and use the text of your life as a tool for reflection? There is Torah in your own life. There's Torah in our lives. And that conversation, right, is ultimately, to me, the most important one.
And you talk, Josh, kind of fearlessly about trying to make the presence of the divine manifest in our lives. And that's a tricky territory for a lot of us Jews who don't talk about the idea of God being present so easily. Tell us what you mean by that. And I'm looking, there's a couple times you mention it, but that you say asking big questions is meant to help us reach this point, not just to be fully here with the Torah and one another, but to make manifest the presence of the divine in our midst. What does that mean to you?
So I think a lot of us are raised explicitly and implicitly with this very, what I would call in a technical way, dualistic notion of God and us. There's God that's up here and, separate from us, and you could do old man with a beard or whatever, but there's some sort of force that's outside us, unmoved mover, whatever philosophical version you want of that. And I think that, Maimonides, certainly the God of Maimonides, which casts a long shadow in Jewish thought, certainly is that way, very Aristotelian. And unfortunately, right, that makes it very hard sometimes to relate. Like, well, what are we talking about with God? It's something I don't believe in, right? I don't have any evidence for, so I have to posit that I believe in it, even though there's no reason. The kind of divinity that we're talking about in this book, and that we certainly is our touchstone at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and I think is certainly shot through the Hasidic, informs the Hasidic approach of Torah, is a non-dual kind of form. And Art Green certainly is the one who has written most eloquently. That it's not, God's not necessarily separate, right? God is immanent. God is present right here. God is available to us. Divinity suffuses our lives. It is here. And there is both duality and non-duality, right? And if you think about even the Magen David of two triangles, one focusing up, one focusing down.
Jewish star, yeah.
A Jewish star, yeah. That the whole point of that is that we have transcendence and immanence at the same time. God is present and God is slightly other than us at the same time. We're trying to reclaim that, right? And say, yeah, it really is here. It's that you can sense this. We all have moments, hopefully many moments, when we can sense the presence. We can be aware of the presence of the divine in our lives, and we shouldn't be afraid of that language. I think that in a lot of ways, Jewish life has become over-intellectualized over many years, and we're trying to sort of pull that back a little bit and, again, give ourselves language that we can express some of the deeper parts of our lives, about our hearts, about our emotions, about our spiritual experience.
I want to end with a quote that you gave, which is a bit challenging, and I think true. You say, too many people in recent decades have experienced Torah and the larger world of Jewish ritual, prayer, text study, and tradition as something to be engaged with, if at all, primarily out of a sense of guilt or duty, not love.
Yeah.
I want to give you a minute to expand on that as we end and what you mean by the word love.
So I think that the love that I'm talking about there is a deep sense of connection, of first of all saying to people who might not feel like this is my tradition or I don't belong in it, you do belong, right? And that the Torah is crazy about you. And there is a place for you and it's calling to you. Number one, you have just as much a right to this inheritance as anybody else. And second is then through that, because of that relationship, that it draws us in and that we can lay claim to it in a loving way. That this is a tradition that is not just, again, intellectually interesting or that I do because of some sense of obligation to ancestors, right? So that's a perfectly legitimate, I want to say, that's a perfectly legitimate reason to do something, out of a sense of duty to ancestors. I'm a big believer in duty, absolutely. And I think for many of us, that stops being sufficient at a certain point. And there needs to be some engagement with, why am I doing this? And what does this mean to me? That it has to take root in my own heart. And I have to feel a sense of love towards it, a broad, encompassing, flowing sense of openness and generosity and at homeness in it. To me, those are all dimensions of love. And so my hope with this book is that that's the experience that many people will have. It may awaken you to a way of engaging with Torah that maybe you haven't had previously, or maybe it'll just deepen an experience that you already have, and that you will get to a place where you're able to, because of this kind of study and this kind of approach, love Torah, love Judaism, love the divine and yourself and other Jews more, because we certainly need it today.
Thank you so much, Josh. Rabbi Josh Feigelson. The book is Eternal Questions, Reflections, Conversations, and Jewish Mindfulness Practices for the Weekly Torah Portion. I hope you will get a copy and find your Chevruta, your study partner. I am so glad you joined us again for In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. See you next time.